In today's video, we're talking about PlayStation's uncertain future, why people are searching how to delete their PlayStation Network accounts, and how my favorite new game just got a great patch. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to PSReady. I almost just did my horror intro. There was so much Halloween news this week, so if you're interested in the Halloween franchise at all, head over to my channel, Jimmy Champagne. So the first thing we're talking about today is all this wild news around PlayStation's future and Jim Ryan. So by the time you're seeing this video, the news is a couple days old, but I'll run through it really quick. Jason Schreier over at Bloomberg put out a news blast Wednesday night, pretty late here Eastern Standard Time, that was like, hey, Jim Ryan is stepping down from his role at PlayStation as the leader of Sony Interactive Entertainment. And then just a few minutes later, there was an official letter put out by Jim Ryan himself over on PlayStation's website. So this is official news now. Jim Ryan is leaving PlayStation. At first, the way Bloomberg announced it made it seem like he was fired or was like a super negative thing or something like that, but it turns out he's actually retiring, and it's not happening immediately. It's happening around April of 2024. And in the interim, his successor is going to be Hiroki Totoki, and there's a lot to talk about here, but I'll just read through his statement or a brief part of it. He said, after 30 years, I have made the decision to retire from SIE in March of 2024. I relish the opportunity to have a job I love in a very special company, working with great people and incredible partners. So yeah, Jim Ryan has been around at PlayStation for around 30 years. And look, there are some things that he's done that I think gamers are like not happy about, for sure, like putting PlayStation's focus towards live service. That wasn't great. Also, the way that he was kind of like saying, oh, we need Call of Duty, we need Call of Duty, we need Call of Duty, we won't survive without Call of Duty. And then he was behind the scenes saying stuff like, oh, we don't need Call of Duty, we're going to be fine without it, which eventually really ended up hurting PlayStation's sort of fight against Microsoft to get Activision away from PlayStation. And of course, stuff like increasing game prices to $70, making there be an upgrade fee, even though they said there wasn't going to be one. And I'm not a huge fan of the whole streaming thing that they're working on, where they're doing the remote play device with the PlayStation Portal, PlayStation Plus's price increases. Like, there are some other things that are negative that I could talk about, but beyond all of that stuff, he has done quite a bit of positive things for the PlayStation ecosystem as well. A ton of great games came out under his watch. This generation's been a little light, but I don't really think it can be fully put on him just because of everything that happened with the pandemic. Like, we've been getting a lot of cross-generational games. It was really hard for developers to kind of transition to working from home, and now they're transitioning back into working at the office. So game production cycles are getting extended, and of course there's a lot of PlayStation 5 games that actually need the hardware coming out. So I'm fine with games getting internally delayed and taking longer than they usually would have, just because of all these extenuating circumstances. And of course, the longer they're delayed, the better state they're going to come out in. And that's something that we've come to expect from Sony, right? Like, games that release and they work and function and run really well at launch. And you can't say that about pretty much any other publisher or developer out there. There are very few developers and publishers who actually finish their games these days, and it really sucks. I'd say that the short list is like Sony and Capcom of companies that release games that actually are, you know, finished. Also, whether in the launch of the PlayStation 5 itself or supply issues really plagued this thing from the start, last year was when things really got good for the PlayStation 5, where anyone who wanted one could really get one. It took a little bit longer than I think people really wanted it to, but just because of these extenuating circumstances that everyone was dealing with for the past 2 years or so, or even a little bit more, again, I think he did a pretty good job, all things considered. A lot of people are going to run with the like he got fired narrative. I personally don't think that's the case at all. I don't think he was pushed out in any way, just mainly because if you take the amount of like negative stuff that happened while he was running PlayStation and compare it to the amount of positive stuff that happened while he was running PlayStation, the goods outweigh the bads, like 99% to 1. He also did an interview where he said, look, the reason I'm retiring is because A, I've been at the company for 30 years, and B, like, this travel that I have to do to have this job in the first place is super strenuous on my body. He said he's living in a fog of jet lag because he was spending like 2 weeks in America a month, and then a week in Europe, and then a week in Japan, and just kind of like living in this fog of jet lag and being on a plane. I don't envy that at all. Of course, he does make quite a bit of money doing it, and it's not a job that I think a lot of people would turn down, being able to run PlayStation, but it's nice to know that while he was in this role, he was doing it right and effectively. Like, he was putting all of his time into running PlayStation, and I could see why after, you know, the whole launch situation with the PS5 where you're getting just criticized at every angle and going through all these court cases with Microsoft and all that, I could see why that would be just taking such an extreme toll on this dude to the point where he's saying, you know what, I'm gonna pass on the role to someone else. It's time for me to retire. Like, he did his job. He got the PlayStation 5 out there. He has a lot of games in development. Spider-Man 2 is coming out in October. I think there's a lot of stuff he can kind of rest his laurels on, where he can say, okay, I did my job here. I can move on to the next thing. Kind of like Sean Layden did between the PS4 and PS5. Like, Jim Ryan took over in 2019, but before that we had Sean Layden. I think people see Sean Layden as one of Sony's best bosses that we've had, at least in my lifetime. Now he's working on live service Chinese stuff, which really sucks because all he does is talk about how game budgets and dev cycles need to get shorter, but then the companies he's going to work for are going to pump out live service games and just free-to-play crap that I don't think anyone really wants. So on the one hand, Hiroki Totoki definitely doesn't seem like someone who's as interested in live service games as Jim Ryan is, and knowing that Sony had 10 in development before they picked up Bungie, I'm wondering how many they actually still have in development, knowing that Bungie kind of made their way through all of Sony's studios and canceled a few of them. Even at Sony's biggest and like most highly regarded developer, Naughty Dog, they said, look, the Last of Us multiplayer game isn't sticky enough, it's not coming together. And instead of going back to the drawing board, it seems like Naughty Dog kind of gutted that team and shifted them over to the new IP and The Last of Us Part 3. So knowing that that can happen to Naughty Dog, I'm assuming everyone else is fair game, right? Like, they have some other ones announced, like Conquered, for example, but it's not too early to cancel a game like that. So I'm wondering if Totoki will be able to kind of go through and reorient Sony back into single player open world action adventure games, because that's what they're really good at, and I think that's what people really want from them. Of course, if they want to do new stuff, I'd really love to see some first person shooters from them. I'd like to see some Starfield style RPGs where there's actual systems instead of like the sort of RPG light mechanics we get in games like God of War or Ghost of Tsushima or Horizon, where the combat is definitely the focus, the graphics are the focus, the world's visuals are a focus, but like being able to interact with the world itself, I'd say is where Sony games are pretty lacking, if you ask me. And on the one hand, that is good, right? Like, having the focus be on the gameplay, I think, is super important, but being able to do stuff like stack a billion sandwiches is pretty fun in Starfield, and I feel like that's an area where Sony is kind of lacking. But what I talk about all the time on Ray's channel when we do the two host videos is that, you know, it is nice to have Xbox having their own thing, which is like Bethesda style RPGs, and then Sony really having the narrative focus, like super high budget, super high graphic fidelity, awesome action-packed experiences. It's nice to have both publishers kind of doing their own thing. The downside that people are pointing out with Totoki, though, that I definitely agree with, is that he's kind of like good at the one thing Jim Ryan didn't really seem to put a lot of effort into, which is mobile gaming. So PlayStation did have a mobile company, they still do, but it has lost so many executives. A lot of the games that were being worked on have been canceled. Even some of the developers that Sony had working on mobile games have been shut down. So like, mobile gaming in the AAA sense isn't really working out the way that I think Totoki wanted. So I'm hoping that instead of making live service games, he doesn't go and make like all this money that they were spending on the live service games be diverted into mobile games. And unfortunately, it seems like mobile gaming is really where things are going to go, at least for a little bit. I don't know if you guys saw this, but at the Apple press conference, they have a ton of AAA games coming to not only the iPhone 15 Pro, but also the iPad M1 chip edition and onward, and also any MacBooks that have an M1 chip and onward. Like my MacBook Air that I use to make all my thumbnails and edit a lot of my videos, that is going to allegedly be able to run Resident Evil Village and Resident Evil 4. Death Stranding, which was originally a Sony exclusive, that is going to be coming to the iPhone 15 Pro, and it actually looks like these games are running at around 720p 30 FPS, which, you know, isn't anything crazy, but that's a really good start for having these games on a mobile phone. And I'm sure Sony is sitting there seeing Ubisoft with the full-on Division game, Capcom with the Resident Evil games, Death Stranding coming from Kojima Productions, and they're saying we should probably be porting a lot of these PC games we're making, like God of War, Horizon Forbidden West, the list goes on, over to iPhones, iPads, and MacBooks, because why not, right? Like, they already tried making games work on phones on the Apple side of the fence in the past. Like, I remember when I got my 15-inch MacBook Pro for college, that's when Steam actually actually launched for the Mac side of the fence, and I played a lot of games on it, but what I ended up doing was just boot camping into Windows because the experience was so much better. But having a game like Resident Evil 4 for $60 in the App Store, that's nothing I expected to ever happen. So I'm curious how this is going to shake out. And it just makes me so frustrated that Sony isn't looking at this phone situation and saying, wow, we should have a device like a PSP3 that can run these games natively. I know that the big difference is an iPhone 15 Pro or Pro Max costs like $1,000 or more. That is definitely a lot more than a $500 PS5. But if they can run games like Resident Evil 4 on a phone, which is going to be throttled because it's titanium and has no active cooling, it stands to reason that Sony could figure out a game console that could run it at least at 1080p 30 FPS. Because if they can kind of eat into the Steam Deck ecosystem where you buy a game one time on the PlayStation Network and then you can play it natively on the go and not need Wi-Fi to connect to your PlayStation 5 remotely, that makes it much more enticing to people like me who aren't really into streaming. And I definitely would pick up a PlayStation handheld because I love the PSP, I love the PS Vita, and I really want them to make a handheld that can play games natively. But overall, I'd say this news is neutral. I don't think anyone stepping down from a role unless they're abysmal is ever good. So it's not bad news, but it's just not like amazing news, right? Like they didn't announce the PS6. It's just an executive stepping down. And it doesn't look like in the short term, at least, anything is going to change that drastically. But one thing that does need to change drastically is Sony's network security, because this hack apparently is getting even worse. Like Sony has realized, it seems like, that these hackers were able to get a lot of the data they said they were able to get. And Sony, it seems like, are shit out of luck. Like this data is going to be ransomed off, and that's bad. And since this is a data breach, a lot of people are pretty freaked out because Push Square is reporting that one of the most PlayStation related search terms right now is how to delete my PlayStation Network account, which, like, I understand the sentiment there. Like the stuff getting out there really sucks. Apparently, like, credit card data could be included, so everyone wants their credit card data to be deleted off the PlayStation Network. But if these hackers already have the data, deleting your PlayStation Network account now doesn't really seem like it'll actually do anything to protect you. Things are definitely not good on the PlayStation Network side of the fence, and they need to figure this out ASAP. And for the last news story today, I wanted to talk about my favorite game of the year so far, except for Resident Evil 4, of course, Lies of P. So this game is a Souls-like. It's very reminiscent of Bloodborne, but once you kind of get into it past the first couple hours, it becomes very clear that it's doing its own thing. My favorite feature in it is being able to kind of craft your own weapons, and you can even do stuff like change the scaling of your weapons. So you can say, hey, I really like this great sword, but I've been speccing into like dexterity, for example. So you can actually change it so that great sword will scale with dexterity. So if you like specced into the wrong class, you can kind of like help yourself later in the game. But one issue I and a lot of other people have had with it is how cheap it can feel at times. Like, I know Souls games are supposed to be hard. I play a ton of Souls likes. I play the ones that From makes. I play the ones that From doesn't make. And the worst thing ever is when they don't have that delicate balance figured out where it feels cheap. Now in these situations, From Software would definitely say get good and never patch it, but the developers of Lies of P thankfully are listening to the community, and they've put out a pretty big patch for the game that not only makes the game easier in parts, but it's really just balancing things out across the board. They decrease the HP of certain monsters, they increase the chance of breaking some monsters' stance and the frequency of stagger, and thankfully they increase the stagger window time. It's not like Jedi Survivor levels of easy, but it is approaching that, right? Like it's getting easier than it was before. They also increase drop rates and balance changes, so if you have not tried this game out, I definitely recommend it. There's another Souls-like coming out in just 2 weeks, I want to say, on the day of my wedding, so I'm not going to be playing it at launch, called Lords of the Fallen. I am really excited for that. I'm assuming that Lies of P's developers don't want to lose a bunch of players to that game, so they made this one a little bit easier so that people will be able to get through the rest of the game by the time Lords of the Fallen comes out. There's also a billion other games out right now that are being played by millions of people, so, you know, making your game a little bit easier. In most cases with the Souls-like, I'd be like, oh man, people just need to get good, but in this case, I'm like, okay, this game needed a balanced patch, and I'm glad I got it. Anyway guys, that's all I've got for you today. Make sure you let me know what you think down in the comments below. Remember to subscribe and set your notifications to all if you haven't already. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and shape on.